The dust of the Roman Republic, thick with the scent of ambition and the clang of distant legions, swirled around a figure destined to reshape its very foundations. This was Gaius Julius Caesar, a name that would echo through millennia, synonymous with power, strategy, and an insatiable drive. Even in his youth, a captivating charisma emanated from him, drawing allies and adversaries alike into his orbit. He possessed an intellect as sharp as any Roman blade, coupled with a strategic brilliance that saw battlefields not as chaotic skirmishes, but as intricate puzzles waiting to be solved. His eyes, keen and penetrating, seemed to gauge not just the immediate threat, but the long game of power. From humble beginnings, Caesar's ascent was meteoric. His early military campaigns, though often overshadowed by later glories, were instrumental in forging his reputation. He quelled local uprisings with efficiency and daring, his presence on the battlefield inspiring his soldiers to acts of unparalleled bravery. These victories were not merely about conquest. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to catch the eye of Rome's powerful elite and, more importantly, to win the hearts of its common people. He understood that true power lay not just in military might, but in popular appeal. Passion fostered an unbreakable bond of loyalty between Caesar and his legions. They saw him not just as their general, but as one of them, a man who understood their sacrifices and shared their dangers. He famously addressed them by name, remembered their deeds, and rewarded their bravery generously. This personal connection transformed his army into an extension of his will, an unstoppable force bound by admiration and devotion. As news of his spectacular victories filtered back to Rome, often exaggerated by his own carefully crafted dispatches, Caesar's legend grew exponentially. The Roman populace, captivated by tales of exhaustion and destruction. Militarily, he was unsurpassed. His campaigns in Gaul expanding Rome's dominion to an unprecedented degree and cementing his reputation as one of history's greatest generals. His military reforms, including the professionalization of the legions and their unwavering loyalty to their commander, fundamentally altered the nature of Roman warfare and governance. Politically, he was a revolutionary, challenging the entrenched power of the aristocracy and championing the cause of the common people, earning their enduring devotion. His reforms in Rome, from calendar adjustments to urban planning, demonstrated a vision for a more organized and prosperous society. Culturally, Caesar's influence was immense. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars became classics of Latin prose, showcasing his literary talent and providing invaluable historical accounts. His image, etched onto coins and carved into statues, projected an aura of power and authority that would be emulated by rulers for generations. Even his name, Caesar, became synonymous with supreme ruler, evolving into Kaiser in German and Tsar in Russian, a testament to his lasting impact on political vocabulary. Yet his legacy is also shadowed by the accusations of tyranny and the brutal reality of his actions. His crossing of the Rubicon, an act of open rebellion against the Republic, plunged Rome into a devastating civil war. His assumption of the dictatorship for life, coupled with his regal displays and disdain for senatorial traditions, fueled the fears of those who believed he harbored monarchical ambitions. The very act of his assassination, though condemned by history as a tragic error, was carried out by men who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic from a king. The enduring question surrounding Julius Caesar is whether his ambition was a necessary evil for the advancement of Rome or a fatal flaw that ultimately led to his downfall and the demise of the Republic. Was he a selfless patriot driven by a vision for a greater Rome, or a cunning autocrat consumed by an insatiable hunger for personal power? Perhaps he was both, a man of profound contradictions, whose genius and flaws were inextricably linked. He was a figure of immense charisma and intellect, a military commander of unparalleled skill, and a political innovator who reshaped the very fabric of Roman society. His rise and fall serve as a timeless cautionary tale about the intoxicating allure of power and the delicate balance between leadership and tyranny. In the end, Julius Caesar's life, though cut short by the daggers of conspirators, had irrevocably altered the course of history. He had, through his ambition, his conquests, and his reforms, laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire, an entity that would dominate the Western world for centuries. His death did not extinguish his influence. Rather, it cemented his legend, transforming him from a powerful general and politician into an icon whose story continues to captivate and provoke debate, a testament to the complex legacy of a man who was both a Roman hero and ultimately a tragic tyrant. The echoes of his life and death resonated through the ages, shaping the destiny of nations and inspiring both awe and fear in the hearts of those who contemplated his extraordinary journey. Exotic lands conquered and formidable enemies vanquished hailed him as a hero. His name became synonymous with triumph, his image that of an invincible warrior statesman. The legions, returning from their campaigns laden with spoils and glory, sang songs of his leadership, further cementing his heroic status in the popular imagination. Gaul, once a distant and vaguely threatening land, was now a testament to Roman power, a vast new province that poured wealth and resources into the Republic. However, beneath the celebratory facade, a different narrative began to take shape in the corridors of power in Rome. Whispers of Caesar's growing wealth, amassed through the spoils of war and the tribute of conquered lands, began to circulate. His lavish spending, his generous gifts to his soldiers, and his ambitious public works projects in Rome were interpreted by the conservative senators not as acts of patriotism, but as calculated moves to buy loyalty and consolidate personal power. The sheer scale of his military achievements, once applauded, now fueled a profound senatorial fear. They saw in Caesar not just a successful general, but a man whose ambition knew no bounds, a man whose popularity and military might could easily overshadow the traditional institutions of the Republic. The Senate, particularly those deeply entrenched in the aristocratic traditions, grew increasingly alarmed. They remembered the Republic's history, punctuated by powerful generals who had seized control, and they saw in Caesar the same dangerous trajectory. His prolonged absence from Rome, while conducting his conquests, had allowed him to build an independent power base, an army fiercely loyal to him alone, rather than to the Republic. The triumvirate, which had once served to balance power, now seemed to have unleashed a force that threatened to consume it entirely. The vast sums of money flowing into his coffers, the unwavering devotion of his legions, and his ever-increasing personal prestige painted a picture of a man rapidly becoming too powerful, too indispensable. The glory of the Gallic Wars, a double-edged sword, had secured Rome's borders and enriched its treasury, but it had also inadvertently sharpened the blade of Caesar's ambition. Each victory, each conquered tribe, each new province added to his already formidable reputation, simultaneously deepening the chasm between him and the fearful Senate. They began to view his return not as a triumph to be celebrated, but as an impending threat to be neutralized. The seeds of conflict, sown in the disparity between popular acclaim and senatorial apprehension, were beginning to sprout, foreshadowing the seismic clash that would soon engulf the Republic. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would redefine the very nature of Roman power, and forever etch Caesar's name into the annals of history, not just as a conqueror, but as a catalyst for profound, irreversible change. The political currents within Rome, already turbulent with the shifting sands of ambition and fear, were about to be irrevocably altered by a singular, unforeseen event. News reached the capital that Marcus Licinius Crassus, the third pillar of the first triumvirate, had met a tragic and inglorious end in Parthia. His ill-fated campaign, a desperate bid for military glory to rival Caesar and Pompey, had instead resulted in a devastating defeat and his own death. With Crassus gone, the delicate balance of power that had uneasily held the Republic together fractured. The triumvirate, once a formidable alliance of three of Rome's most powerful men, now comprised only two, and their relationship, always strained beneath a veneer of cooperation, rapidly deteriorated into open rivalry. The death of Crassus effectively removed the buffer between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. No longer bound by the necessity of a tripartite agreement, their individual ambitions began to clash with greater intensity. Pompey, once Caesar's son-in-law and a crucial ally, now viewed his former partner with increasing suspicion and apprehension. The glory that Caesar had amassed in Gaul, the legions fiercely loyal to him, and the immense wealth he commanded all painted a picture of a man whose power threatened to eclipse even Pompey's own considerable standing. The Republic, already reeling from years of political instability, seemed too small to contain the aspirations of two such colossal figures. As Caesar continued to consolidate his influence in Gaul, Pompey, back in Rome, found himself increasingly drawn into the orbit of the conservative Senate. The patricians, who had always viewed Caesar with deep mistrust, now saw Pompey as their last, best hope to curb the rising tide of Caesar's popularity and military might. They appealed to Pompey's sense of duty, his reputation as a defender of the Republic, and perhaps most effectively, to his own burgeoning jealousy of Caesar's triumphs. Slowly but surely, the alliance between Caesar and Pompey dissolved, replaced by a palpable tension that permeated every corner of Roman political life. Pompey, once the darling of the people and a military hero in his own right, began to align his interests more closely with the aristocratic faction, seeing Caesar not as a former colleague, but as an existential threat to the traditional order that he, Pompey, was now tasked to uphold. Caesar, still engaged in the final stages of his Gallic campaigns, was acutely aware of the shifting political winds in Rome. He received dispatches detailing the Senate's growing hostility, fueled by Pompey's increasingly vocal critiques. Despite the escalating animosity, Caesar made several attempts to maintain peace and negotiate with Pompey. He sent envoys, proposed compromises, and even offered to stand for the consulship in absentia, a move that would have allowed him to retain his military command while seeking political office, thereby avoiding the necessity of disbanding his legions and returning to. He spoke directly to the plebeians, promising reforms, land, and a fairer share of Rome's growing wealth. His promises resonated deeply with a populace often neglected by the patrician class. As his popularity soared, a palpable unease began to ripple through the ancient halls of the Roman Senate. The conservative senators, staunch defenders of the Republic's traditions and their own entrenched privileges, watched Caesar's rise with a mixture of apprehension and disdain. They saw not a hero, but a demagogue, a man whose ambition threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power they had so carefully maintained. Whispers of his Rome as a private citizen. His proposals were not born of weakness, but of a calculated desire to avert civil war, recognizing the devastating consequences such a conflict would unleash upon Rome. He understood that a direct confrontation would tear the Republic apart, and he sought to navigate the treacherous political waters with a blend of diplomacy and strategic maneuvering. However, the Senate, emboldened by Pompey's support and their deep-seated fear of Caesar's ambition, became increasingly intransigent. Their demands grew harsher, more explicit. They insisted that Caesar, upon the expiration of his proconsulship in Gaul, immediately disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand for election. This was not merely a procedural requirement. It was a trap. To return without his legions would leave him vulnerable to prosecution by his political enemies, potentially leading to his ruin or even exile. It was a clear attempt to strip him of his power. to neutralize the threat they perceived him to be. The Senate's hostility was no longer veiled. It was an open declaration of intent, challenging Caesar to choose between obedience to their authority and the preservation of his own political and personal safety. The political maneuvering intensified, each side testing the other's resolve. The Senate, under Pompey's tacit leadership, passed resolutions designed to undermine Caesar's authority and force his hand. They denied him the right to stand for consulship in absentia, a privilege often granted to successful generals. They threatened to declare him a public enemy if he did not comply with their demands to disband his army. The rhetoric in the forum grew increasingly venomous, painting Caesar as a tyrannical figure poised to overthrow the Republic. Yet, Caesar, from his distant command in Gaul, continued to project an image of reason and restraint, hoping to exhaust the Senate's belligerence through patient negotiation. He knew that any overt act of defiance would be seized upon by his enemies as justification for war. The demands for Caesar to disband his army became the central point of contention, an unyielding line in the sand drawn by the Senate. For Caesar, this was not merely a matter of obeying a legal decree, it was a matter of survival. His legions were his power, his protection, and the instrument of his ambition. To relinquish them would be to surrender himself to the mercy of his enemies, a fate he was unwilling to accept. The chasm between Caesar's strategic self-preservation and the Senate's desperate attempt to reassert its authority widened with each passing day. The Republic teetered on the brink, pulled in opposing directions by two titans, their personal rivalry now inextricably intertwined with the fate of Rome itself. The stage was set, not for negotiation, but for an inevitable clash, a conflict that would determine not only who would rule Rome, but what kind of Rome would endure. The forces were inexorably drawing towards a single, fateful point of no return. The weight of Rome's destiny pressed heavily upon Julius Caesar. He stood on the precipice of an unimaginable decision, a choice that would forever etch his name into the annals of history, either as a savior or a destroyer. For weeks, the demands from the Roman Senate had grown increasingly shrill, their ultimatum echoing across the Alps: disband his legions, return to Rome as a private citizen, and face the political machinations of his vengeful enemies. Caesar's internal struggle was a tempest of conflicting loyalties. On one hand, his deep-seated respect for the Republic, the very institution he had sworn to uphold, urged obedience. To defy the Senate was to invite civil war, a horrifying prospect for a man who had dedicated his life to expanding Rome's glory, not tearing it asunder. Yet, his ambition, a relentless burning fire within him, whispered of the humiliation, the potential ruin that awaited him if he yielded. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that to return disarmed was to sign his own political death warrant, surrendering himself to those who sought his destruction. The winter winds howled through the camp, carrying with them the chilling premonition of conflict. His legions, fiercely loyal and hardened by years of campaigning in Gaul, awaited his command. They had marched with him, bled with him, and trusted him implicitly. Their devotion was a double-edged sword. It was his greatest strength, yet it was also the very weapon that threatened to ignite the Republic. Caesar paced restlessly, his mind a maelstrom of strategic calculations and moral quandaries. The Rubicon River, a small, unassuming stream, marked the boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. To cross it with an army meant an act of war against Rome itself, an unforgivable transgression against the Republic. The law was absolute. No general could lead his legions across that sacred boundary without express senatorial decree. The fateful night arrived, cloaked in a heavy, oppressive silence. Caesar gathered his most trusted officers, their faces grim, reflecting the gravity of the moment. He spoke to them of the injustices, the Senate's blatant disregard for his service to Rome, the trap they had set. He painted a vivid picture of the Republic held hostage by a cabal of fearful aristocrats, manipulated by Pompey. He did not explicitly order them to cross. Instead, he presented the stark choice, allowing their shared loyalty and understanding of the desperate circumstances to guide them. The decision, though unspoken, was clear. The options presented by the Senate had left him no honorable path to retreat, only a path to ruin. With a heavy sigh, a decision solidified in his heart that would reverberate through millennia. Alea iacta est, he reportedly declared. The die is cast. The words were a grim pronouncement, an acknowledgement of the irreversible step he was about to take. There was no turning back. The Rubicon, insignificant in its physical form, transformed into a monumental chasm, separating his past as a dutiful servant of the Republic from his future as its challenger. He mounted his horse, his gaze fixed on the dark, flowing waters ahead. His legions, a silent, disciplined force, began their march. The rhythmic thud of their boots on the frozen ground was the drumbeat of civil war, a sound that would soon echo across the entire Roman world. As the first cohorts waded into the shallow waters of the Rubicon, the declaration endless drive for singular authority, a concept anathema to the Republic's ethos, began to circulate, fueling their fear. They knew this man was different. He wasn't content with merely being a part of the system. He sought to master it, to bend it to his will. To counter the Senate's growing opposition and to consolidate his own burgeoning influence, Caesar entered into a pragmatic, if uneasy, alliance. This was the formation of the First Triumvirate, a political pact forged in 60 BCE, binding him with two of Rome's most influential figures. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, a celebrated general riven of civil war, was implicitly made. The act was audacious, defiant, and utterly final. News of Caesar's crossing reached Rome like a thunderclap, sending shivers of panic through the Senate. The conservative senators who had so vehemently pushed for confrontation suddenly found themselves facing the very monster they had tried to cage. Pompey the Great, who had confidently assured the Senate that he could raise legions from Italy with a mere stamp of his foot, was caught entirely unprepared. His grand pronouncements crumbled in the face of Caesar's swift, decisive action. The legions that Pompey had boasted of did not materialize with the speed and loyalty he had anticipated. Confusion reigned in the capital. The city, usually bustling with political intrigue and commerce, descended into chaos. Families frantically packed their belongings, fearing the arrival of Caesar's battle-hardened legions. Pompey, realizing the direness of his strategic position, made a hasty and ignominious decision. Rather than face Caesar in Italy, he resolved to abandon Rome, withdrawing his forces to the south and then across the Adriatic Sea to Greece. His intention was to gather more substantial armies from the eastern provinces, believing he could then return to crush Caesar. But his retreat, executed with unexpected speed and a palpable sense of fear, left Rome undefended and open to Caesar's advance. The city, the very heart of the Republic, was offered to Caesar almost without a fight. Caesar's march through Italy was less a military campaign and more a triumphal procession. Town after town opened its gates, often welcoming him, weary of the Senate's misrule and drawn by Caesar's charisma and reputation for clemency. His actions at the Rubicon had sealed his destiny, not just politically, but personally. He had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. The decision to cross that small river had irrevocably altered the course of his life and the future of Rome. He was no longer just a general. He was a revolutionary, a man who had dared to challenge the established order for what he believed was a greater cause. The die was indeed cast, and the fate of the Roman world now lay precariously balanced on the edge of a sword. The Rubicon was crossed, and the Republic would never be the same. The Civil War, now an undeniable reality, quickly escalated into a brutal contest for the very soul of the Roman world. Caesar, having secured Italy with astonishing speed, immediately turned his strategic brilliance towards consolidating his power and dismantling Pompey's remaining strongholds. The initial skirmishes were swift, characterized by Caesar's relentless pursuit and Pompey's desperate attempts to regroup. Each move was a calculated gamble, each engagement fraught with the personal tragedy of Romans fighting Romans, former comrades now locked in a deadly embrace. Caesar's legions, though often outnumbered, possessed an unparalleled discipline and an unwavering faith in their commander, a faith forged in the crucible of the Gallic Wars. The personal toll on Caesar was immense, a silent burden carried beneath his resolute exterior. He found himself pitted against men he had once considered friends, allies with whom he had shared campaigns and political triumphs. The sight of Roman standards clashing against other Roman standards, the cries of Latin echoing from both sides of the battlefield, must have torn at the fabric of his ambition, even as he pushed forward. Every victory, no matter how decisive, was tinged with the sorrow of a fractured republic. He often extended clemency to captured Pompeian soldiers, hoping to heal the wounds of civil strife. Yet the conflict continued to rage, fueled by the deep-seated fears and resentments of the conservative Senate. The war's climax arrived on the plains of Pharsalus in 48 BCE. It was here that Caesar, with an army significantly smaller than Pompey's, faced his rival in a monumental confrontation that would decide the fate of Rome. Pompey, buoyed by his superior numbers, a vast cavalry, and the support of many senators, felt confident of victory. His battle plan was meticulous, designed to envelop Caesar's flanks and crush his legions. Yet Caesar, ever the master tactician, anticipated Pompey's moves. He deployed a hidden fourth line of infantry, a strategic reserve, to counter Pompey's cavalry charge, turning the tide of battle in a single, brilliant stroke. The clash was ferocious, a maelstrom of steel and blood, but Caesar's tactical genius and the unwavering courage of his veterans ultimately prevailed. The Battle of Pharsalus was a crushing defeat for Pompey and a resounding triumph for Caesar. The Pompeian legions were routed, their dreams of restoring senatorial supremacy shattered on the dusty Greek plains. Pompey himself, witnessing the catastrophic collapse of his army, fled the battlefield in despair. He knew that his cause was lost, at least for the moment, and that his life was now in grave danger. He sought refuge, fleeing across the sea, hoping to find allies and rebuild his forces in Egypt, a kingdom then embroiled in its own dynastic struggles between the young pharaoh Ptolemy III and his ambitious sister, Cleopatra. However, Pompey's desperate flight led him not to safety, but to a tragic and ignominious end. Upon his arrival in Egypt, the advisors of Ptolemy III, eager to curry favor with the victorious Caesar, made a cold and calculated decision. They believed that by eliminating Caesar's greatest rival, they would secure their position and gain the support of the new master of Rome. Thus, as Pompey stepped ashore, he was brutally assassinated, stabbed to death before he could even set foot on solid ground. His head was severed and presented to Caesar upon his arrival in Egypt, a gruesome trophy intended to demonstrate Egyptian loyalty. Caesar's reaction to the death of his former friend and rival was complex and deeply layered. When the severed head of Pompey was presented to him, he did not exult. Instead, a wave of profound sorrow washed over him, mixed with a chilling sense of the brutal realities of power. He reportedly wept, not for his enemy's demise, but for the tragic waste of a great Roman, a man who had once been his ally and son-in-law, now reduced to a headless corpse. The gesture by the Egyptians, intended to please him, instead repulsed him. It was a stark reminder of the barbarity that ambition could unleash, a mirror reflecting the destructive path he himself had walked. While relief undoubtedly settled upon him, knowing that the most formidable obstacle veered for his military triumphs, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, whose financial backing was indispensable. It was a power-sharing agreement, a fragile tripod designed to circumvent the Senate's authority and push through their respective agendas. For Caesar, it was a crucial step, providing him with the political leverage and military command he desperately craved. He understood that sometimes even the most ambitious men must compromise to achieve their ultimate goals. Yet, even in this alliance, the seeds of future conflict were sown. Caesar's ambition was not merely to share power, but to wield it decisively. To his singular rule was gone, a lingering sorrow persisted. The civil war had not only claimed lives, but had also irrevocably altered the moral landscape of Rome. Pompey's death, rather than signifying a clean end, merely deepened the tragedy, illustrating the ultimate cost of their bitter rivalry. Caesar, now the undisputed master of the Roman world, understood that his journey was far from over. The internal wounds of the Republic ran deep, and the path to lasting peace and stability would be fraught with new challenges, new adversaries, and perhaps new betrayals. The shadow of Pompey's death would follow him, a somber reminder of the personal cost of absolute power. The Roman Republic, shattered by the civil war, now lay at Caesar's feet, awaiting its new fate. With Pompey's shadow now receding, albeit grimly, Caesar found himself in Egypt, a land as ancient and complex as the political machinations he had just navigated. His arrival in Alexandria, however, was not merely for political consolidation. It was here, amidst the opulent palaces and the simmering dynastic struggles of the Ptolemaic kingdom, that Caesar would encounter a figure who would indelibly mark his life and alter the course of his ambitions. Cleopatra. She was no ordinary queen, a woman of extraordinary intellect, ambition, and captivating charm. She was locked in a bitter power struggle with her younger brother, Ptolemy III, for control of the Egyptian throne. Caesar, always perceptive, quickly understood the intricacies of Egyptian politics. He saw in Cleopatra not just a deposed monarch, but a formidable ally whose charisma and intelligence mirrored his own. Their initial encounters were likely strategic, a dance of power and influence, yet it swiftly blossomed into a profound and passionate affair. Cleopatra, fluent in multiple languages and a skilled rhetorician, captivated the Roman general, offering him not just her kingdom's resources, but a connection that transcended mere political convenience. For Caesar, Cleopatra represented a different kind of power, a regal authority untainted by the messy compromises of the Roman Republic. Their liaison was intense, a whirlwind of shared ambition and personal affection that defied the conventions of their respective worlds. From this passionate union, a son was born, Caesarion, a living testament to their powerful connection. For Caesar, the birth of a son, especially one with such a lineage, was deeply significant. It provided a potential heir, a continuation of his bloodline, a concept that held immense weight in a society obsessed with legacy and family. While Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesarion as his legitimate heir in Rome, a move that would have been politically untenable and scandalous, his affection for the boy and his mother was undeniable. Cleopatra, for her part, saw Caesarion as the ultimate solidification of her power, binding her fate directly to the most powerful man in the world. Caesar's involvement in Egyptian politics became a direct consequence of his relationship with Cleopatra. He intervened decisively, using his formidable military might and political acumen to secure her position on the throne. The Alexandrian War, a brief but fierce conflict, saw Caesar's legions fighting alongside Cleopatra's forces against Ptolemy V and his supporters. Caesar's victory cemented Cleopatra's rule, ensuring a stable pro-Roman regime in Egypt, a vital grain-producing region for Rome. His actions demonstrated his willingness to use Roman power not just for conquest, but for the personal and political interests of those he cared for, blurring the lines between private affections and public obligations. Back in Rome, however, news of Caesar's prolonged stay in Egypt and his deep entanglement with Cleopatra was met with growing disapproval. The conservative Roman Senate, already wary of Caesar's authoritarian tendencies, viewed his foreign entanglements with suspicion and disdain. They saw his affair with an Eastern queen, his involvement in dynastic squabbles, and the birth of a foreign heir as an affront to Roman traditions and morality. Romans, proud of their republican ideals, were deeply uncomfortable with the concept of a Roman general acting like an Eastern monarch, indulging in luxury and power unchecked by senatorial oversight. Whispers turned into open criticism, fueling the narrative that Caesar was becoming dangerously autocratic, losing touch with his Roman roots. His image, once that of a republican hero, a champion of the people, began to subtly shift in the eyes of many. The Roman ethos valued simplicity, civic duty, and the rejection of monarchical rule. Caesar's actions in Egypt, his association with a queen, and the growing rumors of his regal demeanor painted a picture of a man who was increasingly embracing the trappings of kingship rather than adhering to the principles of a republican leader. The Senate, ever vigilant against any perceived threat to their authority, seized upon these perceptions. They feared that Caesar, having tasted absolute power in Egypt, would return to Rome with an even greater appetite for singular rule, transforming the Republic into something akin to an Eastern monarchy. This perception was further exacerbated by the lavish gifts and privileges Caesar bestowed upon Cleopatra, including her visit to Rome years later, where she was housed in his private villa. Such displays, while common among Eastern potentates, were alien and offensive to many Romans. The idea of a foreign queen, mother of Caesar's son, residing within Rome's sacred walls, reinforced the fears that Caesar was systematically dismantling the Republic's foundations, replacing them with a system more aligned with his personal desires than with Roman tradition. The seeds of resentment sown by his earlier political maneuvers and military conquests were now being watered by his perceived regal ambitions, cultivated in the exotic gardens of Egypt. Caesar, perhaps too enamored or too confident in his own power, seemed largely impervious to these growing concerns. He believed his actions were for the good of Rome, securing its borders, ensuring its food supply, and bringing stability to its client states. He saw himself as a visionary, capable of wielding absolute authority for the benefit of the vast Roman world, a world that had grown too large and complex for the outdated mechanisms of the Republic. Yet in his pursuit of a new order, he inadvertently alienated the very institutions that had defined Roman identity for centuries. His charisma, his strategic mind, and his unwavering resolve suggested a man who would not be content as one-third of a triumvirate for long. There were initial hints, subtle at first, of a relentless drive for singular authority, a yearning to be the undisputed leader of Rome. He moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, making decisions that, while beneficial to the triumvirate, also subtly advanced his own standing. The pact was a truce, a temporary cessation of hostilities in the perpetual war for control of the Republic. But beneath the surface of this uneasy alliance, the current of Caesar's personal ambition ran deep, and love for Cleopatra and his subsequent interventions in Egyptian affairs became another powerful argument for those who feared his boundless ambition, consolidating their belief that Caesar saw himself above the laws and customs of Rome. He was becoming a king in all but name, a dangerous precedent for a republic that had long ago banished its monarchs. The stage was set for his return to Rome, a return that would bring him unprecedented power, but also deepen the divisions that would ultimately lead to his tragic downfall. Upon Caesar's eventual return to Rome, the city erupted in a series of magnificent triumphs, spectacles of unparalleled grandeur that celebrated his victories across Gaul, Egypt, and the various theaters of the Civil War. These were not merely parades. They were meticulously orchestrated displays of power and wealth, designed to solidify his image as Rome's indispensable leader. Chariots laden with spoils, exotic animals from conquered lands, and long lines of captive princes paraded through the Forum, culminating in lavish feasts and games that captivated the Roman populace. The people, weary from years of civil strife and economic uncertainty, readily embraced the peace and prosperity that Caesar's victories promised. They hailed him as a savior, a hero who had brought order out of chaos, and their adoration only fueled his already formidable ambition. With the adulation of the masses secured, Caesar wasted no time in implementing a sweeping program of reforms and ambitious building projects. He understood that true power lay not just in military might, but in the tangible improvements to the lives of ordinary citizens. He initiated projects to drain the Pontine marshes, creating new agricultural land, and planned a massive harbor at Ostia to improve Rome's grain supply. He reformed the Roman calendar, introducing the Julian calendar, a system so accurate it remains largely unchanged today. His economic reforms included debt relief for citizens and the establishment of colonies for his veteran soldiers, providing them with land and a new start. He expanded the Senate, bringing in new members from Italy and even Gaul, diluting the power of the old patrician families and creating a body more loyal to him. These actions, while undeniably beneficial to Rome, also served to consolidate his personal authority, weaving his influence into the very fabric of Roman society. The Senate, stripped of much of its traditional power and filled with Caesar's appointees and allies, found itself increasingly subservient to his will. In a series of unprecedented moves, they began to grant him extraordinary powers. First, he was made consul for 5 years, then for 10, and eventually in 44 BCE, the ultimate honor was bestowed upon him: dictator for life. This title, Dictator Perpetuo, represented a fundamental rupture with Roman Republican tradition. Dictatorships had always been temporary, emergency measures, lasting no more than 6 months. Caesar's perpetual dictatorship signaled a move towards permanent, singular rule, effectively ending the Republic as it had been known for centuries. The irony was not lost on the conservative senators who watched their beloved republic slowly transform into a monarchy in all but name. Caesar's increasing authoritarianism became undeniable. He no longer sought the council of the Senate as a body of equals. Instead, he dictated policy, expecting immediate compliance. He minted coins bearing his own image, a practice previously reserved for monarchs. He appeared in public, dressed in purple, the color of kings and gods, and had statues erected in his honor throughout Rome, some even depicting him as a deity. His disregard for traditional republican norms grew more pronounced with each passing day. He dismissed the established customs and checks and balances that had defined Roman governance, believing himself to be above them, the sole architect of Rome's future. He believed the Republic, with its endless debates and factionalism, was an antiquated system incapable of governing a vast and complex empire. He saw himself as the necessary strong hand, the benevolent autocrat who alone could guide Rome to its true destiny. This escalating authoritarianism, coupled with his regal displays and the perceived arrogance of his absolute power, began to sow deep seeds of resentment and fear among the conservative senators. For them, Caesar's reforms, while perhaps superficially beneficial, were merely a front for his insatiable lust for singular authority. They saw him not as a savior, but as a destroyer of the Republic, a man who, unlike earlier despots, was too popular and too powerful to be easily removed. The old guard, those who cherished the ideals of liberty, the rule of law, and the collegial governance that had defined Rome for centuries watched in horror as Caesar systematically dismantled their institutions. They believed he aimed to establish a hereditary monarchy with himself as king and his Egyptian son, Caesarion, as his eventual successor. The fear was palpable. Many senators, even some who had initially supported Caesar, began to question the path he was forging. They worried for the future of Rome, for the legacy of their ancestors, and for their own positions and influence in a world where one man held all the cards. The whispers of discontent grew louder, transforming from private anxieties into urgent, desperate conversations among those who felt the Republic slipping away. They saw Caesar's actions as a direct threat to the very essence of Roman identity, a betrayal of everything their ancestors had fought and died for. The image of the dictator for life was not one of stability for them, but of tyranny, a word that evoked the darkest memories of Rome's ancient past. The stage was now set for a desperate struggle between the unchecked ambition of one man and the ingrained traditions of a 1,000-year-old republic, a conflict that would inevitably end in bloodshed and profound historical consequence. The escalating authoritarianism and the regal displays of Julius Caesar, combined with the perceived arrogance of his absolute power, began to sow deep seeds of resentment and fear among the conservative senators. For them, Caesar's reforms, while perhaps superficially beneficial, were merely a front for his insatiable lust for singular authority. They saw him not as a savior, but as a destroyer of the Republic, a man who, unlike earlier despots, was strong, an unstoppable force gathering momentum, destined to clash with the very foundations of Roman tradition. He was a man who saw the future not as something to be inherited, but as something to be forged by his own hand, regardless of the obstacles, regardless of the cost. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the drama of a legend's rise, fraught with peril and promise, had truly begun. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. With the political landscape in Rome momentarily stabilized, albeit precariously, by the first triumvirate, Julius Caesar turned his gaze outward, toward the was too popular and too powerful to be easily removed. The old guard, those who cherished the ideals of liberty, the rule of law, and the collegial governance that had defined Rome for centuries, watched in horror as Caesar systematically dismantled their institutions. They believed he aimed to establish a hereditary monarchy, with himself as king and his Egyptian son, Caesarion, as his eventual successor. The fear was palpable. Many senators, even some who had initially supported Caesar, began to question the path he was forging. They worried for the future of Rome, for the legacy of their ancestors, and for their own positions and influence in a world where one man held all the cards. The whispers of discontent grew louder, transforming from private anxieties into urgent, desperate conversations among those who felt the Republic slipping away. They saw Caesar's actions as a direct threat to the very essence of Roman identity, a betrayal of everything their ancestors had fought and died for. The image of the dictator for life was not one of stability for them, but of tyranny, a word that evoked the darkest memories of Rome's ancient past. The stage was now set for a desperate struggle between the unchecked ambition of one man and the ingrained traditions of a 1,000-year-old republic, a conflict that would inevitably end in bloodshed and profound historical consequence. Amidst this simmering cauldron of fear and resentment, the seeds of a deadly conspiracy began to take root. It was not a single, spontaneous act of defiance, but a calculated, desperate measure orchestrated by individuals driven by a complex mix of patriotism, personal grievance, and sheer ambition. At the heart of this burgeoning plot were figures like Cassius, a man whose republican fervor was matched only by his deep-seated animosity toward Caesar, and Decimus Brutus, another close associate of Caesar who felt the weight of the Republic's demise pressing heavily upon him. However, the most pivotal figure to emerge from the shadows was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man held in the highest esteem by Caesar himself, who saw him almost as a son. Brutus was a man of impeccable lineage, a descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, who had famously expelled Rome's last king and founded the Republic. This legacy weighed heavily on him, creating an internal conflict between his loyalty to Caesar and his devotion to the republican ideals of his ancestors. He agonized over the decision, torn between personal affection and what he perceived as his duty to Rome. Cassius, a master manipulator, understood Brutus's internal struggle and relentlessly exploited it, leaving anonymous notes and public appeals designed to stir Brutus's republican conscience. He knew that for the conspiracy to gain legitimacy and moral authority, Brutus's involvement was essential. Without Brutus, the plot might be dismissed as the work of disgruntled opportunists. With him, it could be framed as a noble act of liberation. The conspirators, a diverse group ranging from staunch Republicans to those with personal axes to grind against Caesar, began to hold secret meetings. These clandestine gatherings took place in hushed tones, in shadowed porticos and private villas, far from the prying eyes and ears of Caesar's ever-present network of informants. Each meeting was fraught with tension, the air thick with the unspoken fear of discovery and the enormity of the act they were contemplating. They meticulously planned every detail, discussing the timing, the location, and the method of the assassination. The Senate House, a symbol of Republican governance, was deemed the most fitting stage for their tragic drama, a place where Caesar's tyrannical ambitions would be symbolically confronted and, they hoped, permanently extinguished. Caesar, meanwhile, seemed to float above these growing undercurrents of dissent, wrapped in an almost impenetrable cloak of perceived invincibility. His success had been so absolute, his power so unquestioned, that he appeared to believe himself immune to mortal threats. He had dismissed his personal guard, a move that baffled many of his loyal supporters, claiming that it was better to die once than to live in constant fear. This decision, born perhaps of hubris or a genuine weariness with the burdens of security, ironically created the very vulnerability the conspirators so desperately needed. He had become increasingly isolated, surrounded by sycophants and those who feared him rather than true friends who might have warned him of the impending danger. His public persona, that of an unchallengeable demigod, further distanced him from the groundswell of discontent that was gathering momentum beneath his feet. The tragic irony of Brutus's involvement was perhaps the most poignant aspect of the unfolding drama. Caesar had showered Brutus with honors, promoting him, forgiving his past allegiances to Pompey, and treating him with exceptional deference. He saw in Brutus not just a senator, but a potential successor, a man of integrity and intellect whom he deeply trusted. Yet, it was this very trust that Brutus would ultimately betray, driven by a conviction that the Republic's survival demanded nothing less. The conspirators understood the psychological impact this betrayal would have, not just on Caesar, but on Rome itself. Brutus's participation transformed a mere assassination into a profound act of political and moral reckoning, a desperate gamble for the soul of Rome. The stage was now set for the Ides of March, a day that would forever be etched in the annals of history as the moment Rome's greatest general met his brutal and utterly unexpected end. The Republic, it seemed, was preparing to consume its most brilliant yet most dangerous son. The air in Rome grew heavy, with an almost palpable sense of foreboding, as the Ides of March, a date traditionally associated with settling debts, drew near. Even as the conspirators finalized their deadly plans, the universe itself seemed to conspire to warn Julius Caesar of his impending doom. These were not subtle nudges. They were vivid, terrifying premonitions that assailed those closest to him, particularly his devoted wife, Calpurnia. Calpurnia, a woman known for her quiet dignity and unwavering loyalty, was plagued by nightmares in the days leading up to the fateful Ides. Her sleep was disturbed by visions of her husband, the indomitable Caesar, lying dead in her arms, his body riddled with wounds. She saw the tamed lands of Gaul. This vast, largely unconquered territory to Rome's north represented not just an opportunity for expansion, but a crucible in which Caesar's legend would be forged and his ambition tested. He departed for Gaul, not merely as a general fulfilling a commission, but as a visionary promising conquest and glory, both for Rome and, implicitly, for himself. The legions, fiercely loyal and eager for spoils, marched under his banner, ready to carve out a new chapter in Roman history. The Gallic Wars, spanning nearly a decade, were a brutal testament to Caesar's military genius and his ruthless determination. The house crumbling, its majestic columns collapsing upon a scene of unimaginable carnage. These were not mere anxieties. They were visceral, prophetic dreams that left her trembling and desperate. On the very morning of March 15th, her terror reached its peak. She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, convinced that a great evil awaited Caesar should he venture out. Her pleas were heartfelt and desperate, a torrent of tears and fervent entreaties for him to remain at home that day, to postpone the Senate meeting. She begged him, using every ounce of her influence, to heed her premonitions, to listen to the silent screams of her intuition. Beyond the intimate confines of Caesar's household, the city itself seemed to echo with warnings. Seers, those ancient practitioners who interpreted omens from the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals, had delivered clear and unambiguous prophecies. One particularly renowned augur, Spurina, had famously warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. He had reiterated this warning on multiple occasions, his voice tinged with an urgency that should have chilled even Caesar's resolute heart. Other oracles spoke of portents, strange lights in the sky, animals behaving erratically, and even the appearance of comets, all traditionally interpreted as harbingers of great upheaval and the downfall of powerful men. These were not obscure whispers, they were public pronouncements, spreading unease among the populace and, one might assume, reaching Caesar's ears. Yet Julius Caesar, a man who had defied fate on countless battlefields and navigated the treacherous currents of Roman politics with unparalleled success, remained stubbornly dismissive of these omens. His formidable intellect, coupled with an almost superhuman self-confidence, led him to interpret these warnings as either superstitious nonsense or the desperate machinations of his political enemies. He had always believed himself to be a favorite of the gods, a man destined for greatness, and such petty fears seemed beneath him. This dismissive attitude, born perhaps of hubris cultivated by years of uninterrupted triumph, became a fatal flaw. He saw himself as beyond the reach of mortal superstition, a figure whose destiny was entirely his own to command. The idea that a mere dream or the flight of a bird could dictate his actions was an affront to his rational, conquering spirit. He had faced down armies, quelled rebellions, and outmaneuvered the shrewdest minds in Rome. A few ominous pronouncements were not going to deter him from his duties. The conspirators, keenly aware of Caesar's character and his disdain for such omens, understood that direct threats would only strengthen his resolve. Their strategy was far more insidious, relying on cunning manipulation to ensure Caesar attended the Senate that day. They knew that Calpurnia's pleas, if heeded, could derail their entire plot. Therefore, they dispatched Decimus Brutus, a man Caesar trusted implicitly and had even named as an heir in his will, to fetch him. Decimus, feigning concern and loyalty, played a crucial role in overcoming Caesar's reluctance. He ridiculed the idea of staying home due to a woman's dream, reminding Caesar of his reputation for unwavering courage and his commitment to his public duties. He artfully suggested that Caesar's absence would be seen as weakness, as fear, and would invite mockery from his political opponents. He even twisted the omens, implying that if Caesar truly felt threatened, he should go to the Senate and bravely face whatever awaited him, not cower indoors. Decimus's words, delivered with persuasive charm and an air of genuine concern, slowly chipped away at Caesar's resolve. The dictator, always conscious of his public image and his reputation for boldness, began to waver. The idea of appearing weak or superstitious was far more unpalatable to him than the vague threat of a prophecy. He valued his honor and the perception of his strength above all else. This psychological manipulation proved devastatingly effective. Against Calpurnia's tearful protests and the dire warnings of the seers, Caesar eventually conceded, convinced by Decimus's carefully crafted arguments that his presence at the Senate was essential to uphold his dignity and authority. As Caesar prepared to leave his house, a chilling feeling of impending doom permeated the air, a silent scream from the very fabric of time. The morning light seemed unusually dim, despite the clear Roman sky, casting long, unsettling shadows. Calpurnia's desperate cries echoed in the halls, a mournful dirge for a fate already sealed. Caesar, though outwardly composed, perhaps felt a flicker of unease, a fleeting doubt in the face of such persistent and widespread warnings. Yet his ingrained sense of duty, his unshakable belief in his own destiny, and the subtle, insidious persuasion of his betrayers propelled him forward. He stepped out into the Roman streets, unknowingly walking towards his final, tragic appointment with history, ignoring the chorus of omens that had screamed his name into the winds of fate. Each step he took away from his home was a step closer to the very betrayal he had so arrogantly dismissed. The stage was now meticulously set, the players in place, and the curtain about to rise on one of history's most infamous acts of political assassination. Julius Caesar, accompanied by Decimus Brutus and a retinue of attendants, moved through the bustling streets of Rome, a figure of immense power, oblivious to the invisible threads of conspiracy tightening around him. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and distort, mimicking the twisted intentions of those who walked beside him. As he approached the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was convened, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd, his face etched with urgency. It was Spurinna, the very augur who had so vehemently warned him to beware the Ides of March. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even a fleeting shadow of discomfort, crossed Caesar's face. With a dismissive smile, tinged with his characteristic arrogance, he remarked, "The Ides of March are come." Spurinna, however, met his gaze with an unwavering intensity, his voice low but firm. "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." The chilling rejoinder hung in the air, a final public warning brushed aside by a man convinced of his own invincibility. Inside the portico of the theatre of Pompey, the atmosphere was already thick with a manufactured sense. Campaign after campaign, he led his forces through dense forests, across treacherous rivers, and against fiercely independent Celtic tribes. The battles were often savage, marked by the clashing of shields, the cries of warriors, and the relentless advance of Roman discipline. Caesar's strategies were innovative and often daring, characterized by rapid movements, brilliant siegecraft, and an uncanny ability to turn seemingly impossible situations into decisive victories. He understood the psychology of warfare, employing tactics of division and intimidation to break the will of his adversaries long before the final engagement. The shouts of reverence and anticipation. Senators, patricians, and common citizens alike pressed in, eager to catch a glimpse of the Republic's most powerful man. The conspirators, a silent, deadly tableau, had carefully positioned themselves. They appeared as any other petitioners, their faces masks of feigned deference, their hands clutching scrolls and tablets as if seeking Caesar's wisdom or intervention. Their daggers, meticulously concealed beneath their togas, were invisible to the casual observer, yet their presence pulsed with a malevolent energy, a collective held breath. As Caesar ascended the steps, surrounded by this deceptive throng, the final act of the tragedy began to unfold. Trebonius, one of the conspirators, drew Mark Antony aside, engaging him in a prearranged conversation, effectively isolating Caesar from his most loyal protector. Caesar, now standing before his curule chair, a symbol of his authority, was completely enveloped by the conspirators. Tullius Cimber initiated the attack, approaching Caesar with a petition concerning his exiled brother. As Caesar waved him off, Cimber grasped his toga, a signal for the others. The sudden, brutal assault began. Casca, positioned behind Caesar, struck first, a glancing blow to the neck. The initial shock registered on Caesar's face, a look of bewildered surprise, swiftly followed by a surge of anger. He spun around, attempting to defend himself, but the sheer number of attackers overwhelmed him. The Senate chamber, usually a place of measured debate and grand pronouncements, transformed into a scene of chaotic violence. Blades flashed, reflecting the pale morning light as the conspirators, fueled by a mixture of fear, conviction, and perhaps a touch of madness, plunged their daggers into his body. Each thrust was a statement, a desperate attempt to reclaim a republic they believed he had stolen. Caesar, a man who had faced down armies, now found himself cornered, assailed by those he had considered friends and allies. He fought back, a lion trapped by a pack of wolves, his roars of pain and defiance echoing off the marble walls. Then, amidst the blur of faces and the glint of steel, his eyes landed on a figure that froze him to his core. Brutus. The man he had loved like a son, the man he had trusted implicitly, his protégé, stood among his attackers, a dagger in his hand. The sight of Brutus, his face contorted by a grim resolve, delivered a wound far deeper than any blade. It was a betrayal of the soul, a shattering of the deepest trust. The fight drained from Caesar instantly. His resistance crumbled. The legend, the general, the dictator, was gone, replaced by a man utterly broken by the ultimate treachery. It was at this moment, according to tradition, that he uttered his famous, heart-wrenching words, "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" A question that encapsulated the depth of his shock, his sorrow, his profound disillusionment. With that final whispered lament, Julius Caesar covered his face with his toga, a gesture of both dignity and despair, and succumbed to the onslaught. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, an ironic and poignant end for the man who had defeated his great rival. The marble floor, moments before pristine, was now stained crimson, a stark testament to the brutality of the act. The sudden silence that followed the frenzied attack was deafening, punctuated only by the gasps of horrified senators who had not been part of the conspiracy and the ragged breathing of the assassins. The deed was done. The most powerful man in Rome lay dead, a victim of ambition, fear, and the most intimate of betrayals. The Ides of March had claimed its prophesied victim, but the consequences of this bloody act would ripple through Rome, and indeed, out through history, in ways none of the conspirators could have fully foreseen. The Republic they believed they had saved would soon be plunged into an even greater maelstrom of chaos and civil war. The immediate aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination was a maelstrom of terror and confusion. The conspirators, their hands still slick with blood, brandished their daggers, proclaiming their act as a righteous defense of the Republic. Their voices, strained and hoarse, echoed through the Senate chamber, attempting to pierce the veil of shock that had descended upon the assembly. Senators who were not privy to the plot scattered in a panic, some fleeing the building in disarray, others cowering behind pillars, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and horror. The marble floor, now a gruesome tableau, bore witness to the violent end of Rome's most powerful man, a sight that would forever be seared into the collective memory of the city. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though chaos had truly consumed the heart of Rome. Brutus, his face a mask of grim determination, stepped forward, his blood-stained dagger still clutched in his hand. He attempted to address the fleeing senators, to explain their noble intentions, to articulate the necessity of their brutal act. He spoke of liberty, of the restoration of republican ideals, of freeing Rome from the tyranny of a man who had dared to crown himself dictator for life. Cassius, ever the pragmatist, stood beside him, his gaze scanning the chamber for any sign of resistance. They believed, in their fervent conviction, that the Roman people would hail them as liberators, as saviors of a republic on the brink of monarchy. They had envisioned a triumphant procession, a grateful populace celebrating their courageous deed. Yet, the reaction was not one of celebration, but of profound fear and uncertainty. The streets outside the Senate building, which had buzzed with the usual Roman clamor moments before, fell into an eerie silence. Whispers turned into shouts, then into a collective gasp of disbelief as news of Caesar's death spread like wildfire through the city. The conspirators, expecting adulation, found themselves met with suspicion and terror. They marched through the forum, daggers still aloft, proclaiming their freedom, but the citizens merely stared, their faces betraying a deep unease. The common folk, many of whom had adored Caesar, saw not noble liberators, but dangerous radicals who had murdered their benefactor. It was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and co-consul, who masterfully turned the tide of public opinion. He had initially fled the Senate in fear, but quickly regained his composure, understanding the precarious balance of power that now existed. The sheer scale of his conquests was unprecedented, expanding Roman territory dramatically and securing its northern frontiers against barbarian incursions. What truly set Caesar apart during these campaigns was his personal involvement. He was no distant commander, issuing orders from the safety of his tent. Instead, he was invariably found at the heart of the fray, risking his life alongside his soldiers. He shared their hardships, marched with them through snow and mud, and fought beside them on the blood-soaked fields of Gaul. His uniform was often as muddied and worn as any legionary's, his face grimed with sweat and dust. This direct participation negotiated with the conspirators, offering them a semblance of peace in exchange for Caesar's public funeral. This was a critical miscalculation on the part of Brutus and Cassius, who, in their desire for a swift resolution and a public acceptance of their actions, underestimated Antony's rhetorical prowess and his deep loyalty to Caesar. At the funeral, held in the Roman Forum, Antony delivered a eulogy that would become one of the most famous speeches in history. Standing over Caesar's body, which lay in state, he began by seemingly praising the conspirators as honorable men. But with each carefully chosen word, with each theatrical pause and emotionally charged gesture, he systematically dismantled their claims of patriotism. He recounted Caesar's triumphs, his generosity to the Roman people, his refusal of the crown, and the tears he shed for the poor. He read Caesar's will, revealing bequests of money and public lands to every Roman citizen, a stark contrast to the conspirators' narrative of a tyrant. Antony's words, delivered with passionate conviction, stirred the emotions of the Roman populace, transforming their fear into outrage, their confusion into a furious desire for vengeance. He pointed to Caesar's wounds, each gash a silent accusation against the honorable men who had inflicted them. The crowd, initially hesitant, grew increasingly agitated, their murmurs swelling into a roar. The tide had turned decisively. The conspirators, who had dared to show their faces in the forum, were now perceived as villains, their actions a heinous crime against Rome itself. They were forced to flee the city, realizing too late the profound error in judgment they had made. In the ensuing chaos, a new, formidable figure emerged from the shadows: Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and designated heir. A young man, barely 18, Octavian had been studying abroad when news of his adoptive father's death reached him. Despite his youth, he possessed an astute political mind and an unwavering determination to avenge Caesar and claim his inheritance. His arrival in Rome was met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, but he quickly demonstrated a shrewdness that belied his years. He allied himself with Mark Antony and another of Caesar's generals, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate, a new, uneasy alliance forged in the crucible of vengeance. This alliance was not a return to republican ideals. It was a pact for power, with the explicit goal of hunting down and punishing Caesar's assassins. The stage was set for a new period of brutal civil war, even more devastating than the one Caesar himself had waged against Pompey. The very act meant to save the Republic had, ironically, plunged it into an even deeper abyss of conflict and instability. The dream of a restored Republic, so fervently held by Brutus and Cassius, crumbled before the relentless march of personal ambition and the burning desire for retribution. The Ides of March, meant to be an end, had instead become a bloody beginning, fulfilling a tragic prophecy not of peace, but of prolonged strife and the ultimate demise of the Roman Republic itself. The echoes of Caesar's fall would resonate for decades, shaping the destiny of Rome and paving the way for an entirely new political order. The civil war that followed Caesar's assassination was a brutal and protracted affair, a grim testament to the instability unleashed by the conspirators' actions. The Second Triumvirate, comprising Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, systematically hunted down those responsible for Caesar's death. Brutus and Cassius, the leading figures of the conspiracy, found themselves cornered at the Battle of Philippi. Their armies were decisively defeated, and facing capture and humiliation, both men chose to take their own lives, falling upon their swords in a desperate final act. Their deaths marked the end of the Republican dream they had so vehemently championed, a dream that had ironically been shattered by their very attempt to preserve it. The other conspirators met similar fates, caught in the relentless grip of retribution, their names forever etched in history as both liberators and regicides. With the assassins eliminated, the Second Triumvirate, born of vengeance, soon began to unravel. The uneasy alliance between Octavian and Mark Antony, both powerful and ambitious, fractured under the weight of their competing aspirations. Another civil war, even more devastating, engulfed Rome. The Battle of Actium, a pivotal naval engagement, saw Octavian's forces decisively defeat those of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who had formed a powerful, if controversial, alliance. Antony and Cleopatra, like Brutus and Cassius before them, chose suicide over capture, their tragic end closing a dramatic chapter in Roman history. Octavian, now the sole undisputed power in Rome, stood at the precipice of a new era. He had inherited not just Julius Caesar's name and fortune, but also his unparalleled ambition and strategic genius. Learning from Caesar's mistakes, Octavian meticulously consolidated his power, carefully avoiding the appearance of tyranny. He understood the Roman people's deep-seated aversion to kingship and their yearning for stability after decades of civil strife. He gradually dismantled the republican institutions, not through overt force, but through a series of shrewd political maneuvers, presenting himself as the restorer of peace and order. In 27 BCE, Octavian famously relinquished his extraordinary powers, ostensibly returning authority to the Senate and the Roman people. In return, the Senate bestowed upon him the honorific title of Augustus, meaning the revered one, and granted him unprecedented authority, becoming Rome's first emperor. This carefully orchestrated transition marked the official end of the Roman Republic and the dawn of the Roman Empire, an empire that would endure for centuries and profoundly shape the course of Western civilization. Julius Caesar, though never officially an emperor himself, had laid the foundational stones for this monumental transformation. His relentless pursuit of singular authority, his dismantling of traditional republican norms, and his establishment of a powerful, centralized leadership had created the very conditions necessary for the imperial system to flourish. Caesar's legacy was, and remains, a complex tapestry woven with threads of glory and tyranny, innovation